Hello and welcome to day one of this two-day conference organized by the Tax Justice Network on the subject of how to pay for the climate transition. Joining us for this event, we have some world-class speakers and panelists and an audience drawn from across the globe. We are delighted you can join us. And my name is John Christensen. I am director of the Tax Justice Network and I will be moderating today's event. Before we start, there are just a few housekeeping rules I want to draw your attention to, which apply both to today and to tomorrow's event. First of all, the Zoom menu, which hopefully you can see, provides for a chat facility and a question and answer facility. If you want to ask a speaker a question, please use the question and answer facility, not the chat facility. Now, we are recording this event and we will be making the recording available on Tax Justice Network YouTube channel, though possibly not before the year-end break because the editors might want to play around a bit. If you want to tweet this event, please use the hashtag #ClimateJustice. Now, many of the speakers and panelists at this event contributed articles to our Tax Justice Focus special edition on financing the climate transition, which is available online from the Tax Justice Network website at www.taxjustice.net. The links will be put into the chat channel. As it happens, the editor of that special edition, James Henry, will be interviewing James Boyce in a session later today. Now, day one of the conference will largely focus on economic issues. We want to escape from the lazy thinking that there just isn't enough money to finance the climate transition. And we want to build on the assumption that whatever is technologically feasible is also financially feasible. And whatever is socially necessary, like protecting people from ecological disaster, is also financially feasible, and need not, in fact, should not come at the expense of the poorest peoples on our planet. Day two, tomorrow, will address the politics of financing this paradigm shift away from the fossil fuel era and confronting the way in which neoliberals are currently co-opting the language of the Green New Deal to build a new consensus around the status quo, which suits their agenda, but not ours. Now, much as it might warm our hearts to hear politicians adopt the language of the Green New Deal, we must be critical of this co-option process. In most cases, the size of what they're proposing so far is nowhere large enough to meet the urgency of the situation. The scale of what's being proposed largely fails to address the urgent needs of the global South. The speed of adoption of what's being proposed is nowhere near sufficiently ambitious. Too often it's just a case of kicking the can down the road for future generations to deal with. And in too many cases, the ideological structure of what is being proposed, including in Europe, involves incentivizing private financiers to invest in the Green New Deal, therefore privatizing the gains and socializing the risks. Just an example of this, earlier this year, former Bank of England Governor Mark Carney, talking about the existential risks posed by climate crisis, said that this represented the greatest commercial opportunity of our time. I don't think it's appropriate, and I'm sure you don't think it's appropriate to see this as the greatest commercial opportunity of our time. This is something much bigger. So we want to use this conference to discuss some progressive ways to finance the transition away from fossil fuels, and to do this in ways which achieve a paradigm shift in terms of social, economic, and ecological transformation. And I think this requires that we recognize, as Franklin D. Roosevelt recognized, or came to recognize in the 1930s, that a real New Deal, whether it's red, green, or any other color, must involve a fundamental redistribution of economic and political power. And that brings me to our keynote speaker for today's event. We're delighted to have Suzanne Dhaliwal open this event because we want, from word go of our discussions, to recognize that climate justice does not stand in isolation from racial justice or gender justice or social and economic justice. These are indivisible elements of a global struggle to rebalance existing power structures. And the agenda of radical change that we seek requires that we decolonize existing power structures and start over. So Suzanne is the ideal person to discuss how we decolonize climate justice, since her work as a campaigner and as a lecturer and as a researcher and as a creative thinker is focused on precisely that. Suzanne is the director of the UK Tar Sands Network, which she co-founded in 2009. The Tar Sands Network campaigns in solidarity with frontline Indigenous communities in Canada to resist the harms caused by the tar sands industry and to promote disinvestment from fossil fuels. Suzanne has also led similar campaigns in the Arctic and in the Nigerian Delta region. In 2018, London's Evening Standard newspaper voted Suzanne as one of the most influential people working on environmental issues. Suzanne, thanks for joining us. The floor is yours for around 15 minutes, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience.
Thank you. Thank you, John, for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation today to speak to some of the themes around not only fighting for the rights to climate justice, but also for the resourcing and to understand how we're going to shift away from the toxic economy that we're currently in towards the envisioning a future that is both sustainable and also can bring the climate into balance. And so I wanted to start off by just sharing some movement history. And I think movement history is really important in order to ground ourselves as we think about the future. It's really important to think about how did we get here? How did the movements that are currently trying to shift the economic paradigms and the power structures, how did they come into inception and what are they grounded in? So you mentioned in the introduction around the tar sands, and I'm just going to paint a little bit of a picture of the tar sands. So as we know, across the planet, while we hit peak oil and we imagine that the market forces and technology would shift us away from oil towards renewable energy, instead, we moved into unconventional fossil fuels. So unconventional fossil fuels include tar sands, they include fracking, and that is exactly what is happening in Alberta, Canada. So we often hear about the deforestation happening in the Amazon. However, the boreal forest, which is in northern Alberta, is undergoing the second largest rate of deforestation. So what we're seeing there is the fight to get the bottom of the barrel, the last dregs of oil, instead of transitioning to renewable energy, means that tar sands is being extracted. For 1 barrel of tar sands oil, it also takes 3 to 5 barrels of water, it takes high amounts of natural gas, and also huge amounts of devastation to the territory. So the whole economics of the tar sands is upside down. You're basically using caviar to make spam. You're devastating a territory which is the size of England and Wales. And also this oil is being set to be shipped to Russia and China and all the way down to the south. So the logic of the oil economy itself is completely upside down. And so that's why we have to think about how does the climate crisis arrive? And that's why when we're decolonizing, we have to pull back in time and understand that the devastation that is happening in the tar sands is part of, years and years of genocide, of slow industrial genocide, of colonialism and devastation to those territories. So any of the solutions that we have need to include addressing the climate crisis at the core. So when we're talking about decolonization, that's very different from diversity. It's talking about the land and the land struggles. So our movements must be centered in the land and the halting of the fossil fuel extraction, as well as coming up with new solutions. So with the tar sands network, when we found out about the devastation that was happening in Canada, we allied with Indigenous communities there. And a lot of our work involved working with social justice, but that also involved following the pipeline of money and corporate power that was fueling this crisis. So we set about going to the annual general meetings of Shell and BP, the corporate powers that have been extracting tar sands, and also the banks. So we've been pushing for these banks and corporations to not only stop their investments in the tar sands, but for a fundamental paradigm shift on how corporations are operating. So for instance, with our banking work, that has meant not only asking for those banks to stop financing projects such as the tar sands and coal, but to shift policies so that any projects that do not have the free, prior, and informed consent of communities cannot go ahead. And that is essential, is that as we're shifting and pushing financial institutions, we're not just calling for individual projects to be stopped or just for the climate purposes, but essentially the human rights violations, the Indigenous rights violations of those projects also need to be held to account. The UN acknowledges that 80% of the biodiversity that needs to be protected on the planet is either under the land rights or sovereign rights or unceded territory of Indigenous peoples. Therefore, this struggle, this fight, and allyship to hold these banks and corporations accountable has to be core to the work. With the climate negotiations halted this year and delayed until 2021, that doesn't mean that the work of climate justice can end. It continues, and we need to escalate and elevate the allyship with the communities who are calling these banks and corporations to account. And that hasn't just been in the last few years. Often the climate movements have rewritten history a little bit, and we can think they just emerged in the last few years. However, this struggle to hold these corporations to account, to ask for free, prior, and informed consent is something that has been happening for a while. So we also have to fundamentally shift what the work of climate justice looks like. Communities from the global south and from the Indigenous north are not just on the front lines of these devastations, of the health crises that come with slow industrial genocide. They are also on the forefront of the solutions. So we have to see how we can also resource those communities in the movements themselves. Because as we're building this climate justice movement, we have to make sure that the labor itself as well of the movement centers those communities. So as I mentioned, for the last 10 years, we've been working to shift the paradigm within those corporations. And we have to make sure that we are fundamentally shifting the fact that fossil fuels, such as tar sands, can no longer be seen as a viable investment. And the other part of that is to recognize Indigenous rights. Globally, Indigenous communities are standing up for their land. As we're seeing in India right now, 3.3% of the global population is currently in a global mobilization with farmers standing up for their land, for the reversal of farming laws that give the rights to corporations over communities. So there we see that the leadership is coming from the grassroots, as well as seeing some of the hottest, some of the overfaced, some of the food shortages and the exasperation of those crises by the coronavirus. At the same time, those communities are leading the way in terms of how we could hold not only the corporations, but the governments accountable, who are putting the interests of corporations ahead of communities. So I think that's one thing I really want us to think about as we move into 2021, is how do we also see communities in the global south as the leaders, as part of this movement. Sorry. So as we think about many of the proposals on the table for a Green New Deal, for this transition economy, I think it's also important, as we think about how our movements have been created, to ground ourselves in this moment and to understand that the climate crisis is already here. While we're thinking about stopping future emissions and moving ahead, we also have to understand that currently Indigenous and POC communities are already facing the brunt of climate crisis. So we have to integrate a language around environmental justice, looking at how air quality, access to water is also part of that situation as well. And the reason why I bring that up is because in the last year, we've seen some of the biggest cyclones. In May, Cyclone Amphan hit 10 million people and displaced people across Bengal, northern India and Bhutan. However, the response from the climate justice community was nominal. It was not there at all. We saw a media silence on this crisis. So we really have to think about, in our climate literacy, understanding the humanitarian impacts that are already playing out. Where do they factor into the cost? Where do they factor into the work? And also the vision of how we need to build infrastructure for the transition as well. We need to make sure that nobody is left behind. And that means in this interim period, we're also designing climate campaigns and climate initiatives that address the climate crisis from a humanitarian perspective as well. So, as I said, we can't wait for the COP21 to the next COP, to emerge, for this work to continue. And that is why I think it's really essential that we ask questions of the labor of the climate movement itself. For instance, many of the communities, indigenous communities, have been leading for changes in financial policies, for the assertion of land rights. However, they are the least resources communities within the climate movement. So as we think about building up leadership, as we think about building up expertise, and as that decolonisation supports those communities who are resisting the removal of their territories, we have to make sure that we're also redistributing the resources within the movement itself. That's a key question to ask ourselves around accountability. And then the other part is to think about the creativity that we need as we move forward. With the shift that we require, we can't necessarily rely on the powers who got us into this position to lead us out of it. So while we're calling on our governments to adopt the Paris Agreement, while we are pushing for those, we also need to think about new power structures. How are we supporting youth and innovation, interdisciplinary creative responses to the crisis as well? As we've seen, we couldn't rely on the energy companies to shift from conventional oil to the renewable energy that we needed. Instead, we're stuck in a paradigm of unconventional oil. So we also need to think about working with new partnerships and new innovations so that we can come up with those solutions ourselves. And one of the last things I want to end on, one of the sectors that I've been most excited to work in recently has been the insurance sector. And that's the other part, to really think about unlikely allies. So the insurance sector itself has acknowledged climate change, and since the 1970s. And so as the tar sands network, we've been working closely with insurers and the coal to move away from coal and to move away from underwriting tar sands projects. And that has been an incredible shift away from these fossil fuels. So that's another element to this. How can we work with those within different financial parts of the sector who understand the crisis, and to build the relationships and the networks that we need to get us to the future? So thank you.
Thanks, Suzanne. Now, everybody out there, those who've joined whilst Suzanne's been talking, welcome to this event. Please, if you have any questions for Suzanne, put them into the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. You'll find a pull-up menu and you can put your questions there. Suzanne, you just mentioned the insurance industry and working with the insurance industry. And yeah, I mean, they have skin in the game. And it's good to hear that they are responding. But have you kind of had any response, good response, from other, let's say, fund managers, for example, because they have huge investments in fossil fuels and in upstream oil and gas? How have you found that they're reacting? And when you kind of put pressure on, when you meet banks and other big investors in the tar sands or oil and gas more generally, how do you find they react? I mean, have they all gone beyond denial now and are all saying, yeah, the future, we can see the future lies elsewhere and there's a bonanza to be had, like Mark Carney was saying? Or what do you find, how do you find they react?
Yeah, I think there's a few elements to that. One element has been that when we started this in 2009, we were in a situation where people didn't even acknowledge climate change. They didn't even know what tar sands oil was. And through consistently educating not only the corporations on the real risks involved with tar sands extraction, I think that's what's shifted the economy now, where, you know, we often come with the human rights implications, the indigenous rights implications, but the finance itself speaks for itself. So now we see that stock managers, large hedge funds understand that tar sands is not a good investment. So even from the investment front, tar sands is starting to lose track from that way. We've had huge projects that have been delayed, that have been stopped. However, that's a real big question, because even if those corporations are divesting and the divestment movement has kicked off, we have to think about the cleanup and the implications of who is going to clean up that land. And also there are economic implications for the communities as well themselves, who often still rely on contractors from the oil company. So it's a really complex moment wherein we've had the successes of the divestment movement. Tar sands oil is now seen as a bad investment, but we're also now into the questions of, okay, once we do divest, what does that mean for reinvestment? And also, if one company or corporation pulls out, how do we make sure that another one doesn't, and that the projects and the nature of the projects themselves become unfundable, uninvestable?
Now, you've talked about, this year is an exceptional year, obviously, because of COVID. I kind of track these things in the Financial Times, and from what I can see, some of the big super majors, the old big companies, have this year written off record numbers of, in terms of hundreds of billions of stranded assets. Do you see something similar happening with tar sands? And do you think that once the COVID pandemic's finished, tar sands will come back into production? Or do you think a lot of this this is now a permanent feature? In other words, the oil companies are going to be pulling out of tar sands because they're very high cost production, aren't they?
Yeah. I think smaller companies have been pulling out. However, as we know, that's when the larger oil companies actually go in and buy up a lot of these smaller projects. So we have to be really careful that actually probably some of the larger oil majors have acquired tar sands projects in this time. The other point is the Canadian government and the oil companies have been operating as though the pandemic has not happened. For instance, pipelines continue to be built. Temporary workers continue to fill up the man camps, which also bring with them sexual violence epidemic. So I think we have to be really careful that even though we've been witnessing, you know, small localized decreasing of pollution in certain areas, the oil companies have not stopped. It's same in the Amazon, in the Ecuador. The oil companies have continued, especially under sort of, you know, governments such as Bolsonaro. There has been an increase in deforestation and in oil production as well.
Okay, I'm going to move to some of the questions that have come through either on the chat channel or the Q&A channel. The first question which came through from Rose Bridger, and this is for you, Suzanne. Can you expand on the different ways that governments are financing and supporting extreme oil, and what can citizens groups do about that?
Yeah. So in Canada, for instance, Canada continues to subsidize tar sands companies. They also continue to allow companies to get licenses for projects that do not have, as I mentioned, the free, prior and informed consent of communities. So essentially governments are allowing the ongoing genocide, land theft, land grabs of communities, especially on the sites of tar sands. The other way in which this is happening is that there has been actually no cumulative impact assessment, environmental assessment of the full impact of these projects. So governments are basically, and especially this was another impact of coronavirus, that suddenly all environmental impact assessments were not required as well. So that's how the government is doing that. We actually tried to support a EU transport legislation, which was trying to stop tar sands oil coming from Europe. And the Canadian and UK government worked together to undermine that, using the free trade agreements as a kind of collateral. So that's another way, using trade agreements to undermine climate legislation, as well as the ongoing subsidies that we know happen to oil and gas.
Thank you. Now, this is a question from Canali James, or maybe James Canali. Sorry, it's on the screen, it's Canali James. Great reflection, Suzanne. My question is, how feasible is it to deal with global lobbyists and conglomerates who are investing in extractives that have budgets sometimes larger than the states that are engaged or involved?
Yeah, I think, well, that's where I mentioned about taking the leadership and inspiration from global movements. For instance, as I mentioned, in India, we have a population there, because of the coronavirus, more people have died from hunger from the virus itself. So there you're seeing a land mobilization of people who are taking on the Modi government. They're taking on those corporate interests because it's life or death. And that is the situation for many indigenous communities globally. As I said, this has been like 500 years of extraction of their land, of devastation. So as much as possible that we can work with labor movements, with farmers movements, with those sovereignty movements, and we have to support the actual on the ground taking back of infrastructure. I think, you know, is it realistic? I think we're in a place where we have to imagine, we have to, especially when we're working to protect water and life as well. So yeah, understand the movements that are already on the ground, understand the 500 years of devastation that they've already resisted to get here. And also, we have to have a diversity of tactics. We can't look for a single bullet. We all have to be working in our different spaces, but in coherence together.
Yeah. That's a particularly important point about diversity of tactics. Now, the next question is from Joanna Kinsella, who asks, which financial institutions do the oil companies channel their money through? Is it mainly funds, pension funds, private equity?
Yeah, I think if we have to understand that the oil companies, they're prolific in all of our financial institutions. If you think about a nation like the Netherlands, for instance, Shell is one of the largest providers of pension funds, of mutual funds. That also trickles into the school system, into our art galleries, into our cultural institutions. So that money is moving through everywhere. So one way that you can touch it on a personal level is to look at your pension, see where your pension provider is there, and then also the banks. So the larger banks, especially, and you know, especially when we had the Royal Bank of Scotland was state-owned, we put a lot of pressure on them at that time. So most major banks are invested in oil. It's the foundation of our economy. And then also insurance providers, a lot of insurance, not only provide insurance, but they also have investments in oil and gas as well. So that's a really interesting point as well, that a lot of the financial institutions are not only providing financial services, but they themselves have investments in oil and gas as well. So that's another way that we can put pressure on investment as well.
Sorry, I got muted. Don't know how that happened. So here's a question a provocative question from James Henry in Florida. Has Wall Street woken up? Is JP Morgan still financing fracking? And are any major investors shorting the fossil fuel sector?
Yeah, I think they're waking up, but maybe not for the reasons that we want them to wake up. They're waking up because, as I mentioned, tar sands oil is not a good investment. As more pipelines are stopped, as there's more indigenous resistance, this oil is getting landlocked. This oil also comes with reputational risk now. There's so much activism and protesting that happens with this oil. So it's becoming not such a great investment. However, even if these oil companies are pulling out of it, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're investing in renewable technology, or they're investing in the renewable technology with a human rights framework. And a really classic example of that is Tesla, for instance, that, you know, tried to have a whole coup in Bolivia in order to access lithium. So we do see that the oil majors are shifting, they are leaving the tar sands, but it also begs the question of what is left behind. As I mentioned before, as we divest, say, from Nigeria, who is going to clean up? Who's going to provide the reparations for the devastation that has happened as well? So we have to think about that. As we're pulling the money out of the oil companies, are we also making sure that those communities who have been working there, the temporary foreign workers, the laborers that are there, are also coming there as well? So yeah, Wall Street has woken up to the time of oil is over, but how we're reinvesting is a real big question.
Right, thank you. Now, the next question is a question and a comment, and probably just introduction. Hello, everyone. I'm Fernando Cortez from ONG Defensa Ambiental from Chile. We are actually working with communities in their territories, trying to give them climate justice. So thanks to everyone. I'd like to know how we can make this access to justice effective, since the mere recognition of their rights through Convention 169, at least here, is not enough, because there are no mechanisms to guarantee the rights. It's complex, but perhaps there could be other global agreements. So you have a specific situation there in Chile, but do we have the right framework, global frameworks in place to protect the rights of indigenous peoples?
We don't. And I think that's a really, really important point around the Paris Agreement. There are no indigenous rights within the Paris Agreement. There are no human rights in the Paris Agreement. So that's why I'm really urging that we don't put all our eggs in that basket. So the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People is daily violated by corporations and governments and banks. That's why we need these specific shifts in lending policies, so that you cannot even get financing for projects that violates indigenous rights, and that corporations need to be held accountable. And that's, you know, some of the work that Polly Higgins has been doing around ecocide and the crime of ecocide. So what we need more is global international solidarity, more awareness on connecting these struggles, understanding that what's happening in the tar sands is happening in Chile, is happening in Nigeria. This is where we also need a fundamental shift in the way climate justice work happens at the moment. That work needs to be resourced so that we can expose the specific projects, the territories, build relationships, and also do the media work. We've really been an erasure of the Black and brown voices in our climate. And media is a really key part to that, to raising that international awareness.
Thanks. I think we only have time to fit in 2 more questions, Suzanne, if that's okay with you. So the first one comes from Declan Owens, and it's a bit of a leading question. Do you agree we need system change, i.e. some form of socialism, to achieve climate justice?
Yeah, I mean, we know we can't continue. We've reached a tipping point in terms of where we can get to with the current paradigm, of course. I think what that looks like for everyone is very different. And I think that's a part of decolonization, is that something that works for one isn't going to work for all. And that's also where recentering the movement comes about, where what that looks like in India, for instance, for the Global South, which is actually being led by a socialist labor movement, but it's working in tandem with indigenous communities who are fighting for their rights as well. That's going to be very different than what it's going to look like in the UK in a post-Brexit coronavirus world, where we're going to have different kinds of food shortages, labor shortages, all of those sort of things. So making sure that we're not going into a one size fits all paradigm. And I think that's what's going to be different than what we have right now, which is monoculture, which is these like over governmental policy. So as much as we can listen to the on-the-ground needs, understand what is there, but what I think we're all united on is knowing that, you know, we've reached the end with this paradigm.
Thanks. And thanks to all the questioners for submitting your questions. This is our last question. It comes from Su Ming-Ku. And the question is, how can anti-extractive campaigners deal with the potentially financially disastrous corporate legal tactic of countersuits?
Well, I haven't actually seen countersuits happen. Mainly what happens is for frontline communities, there are threats to frontline environmental defenders. We've seen an increase in environmental defenders being murdered. But I haven't necessarily seen a countersuit unless BP and Shell haven't come after me. I think the main thing is if you have a large community movement, if you have a coalition, that's where coalitions are really important, from the grassroots to larger NGOs as well, to protect each other within that. But I don't necessarily think that the corporations will countersue, especially if your case against them is watertight, that they are violating rights, that they are violating the water rights as well. So having your case set up from the beginning, that you understand that you are in the right, is the best way to go around that. And I think, you know, currently there are some huge youth litigations actually suing corporations for the, you know, the removal of their future in a sense. So I would say that yeah, I wouldn't let that necessarily stop you. What would be the main thing would be to ensure your security, and mainly ensure the security of the people who are on the front line of that project.
Well, thanks, Suzanne. Thanks for a great start. Sue Ming-Ku has come back saying she was referring specifically to the Chevron Ecuador case, but I'm afraid we don't have time to kind of go down that route because I'm having my arms twisted behind the scenes here to move on to the next session. So I know everyone will join me in thanking you very much, Suzanne, for a great start to the event, and I hope you'll be able to stick around to hear more of the talks. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, everyone.